Welcome to the Money Mastermind Show. Let's talk money.
And welcome to the Money Mastermind Show. Tonight, we are talking about financially recovering from a divorce. To help us with tonight's topic is Valerie Rind of ValerieRind.com, and she is also the author of the book Gold Diggers and Deadbeat Dads. And Valerie, thank you for joining us tonight.
Pleasure to be here, Glenn.
And of course, we have the members of the Money Mastermind Show. We have Kyle Prevost of YoungandThrifty.ca, Miranda Marquette of Planting Money Seeds, Peter Anderson of Bible Money Matters, Tom Drake of the Canadian Finance Blog, and myself, Glenn Craig of Free From Broke. And before we start, if any of you are out there watching us live, please head over to our event page if you have any questions about financially recovering from a divorce. We have a Q&A app there, and we love getting questions to answer. So, divorce is something that we, certainly in the media, it's portrayed as almost comically being financially devastating, but I can't even imagine having to go through it. It seems to me that it's almost right up there with like losing an immediate member of the family, being that maybe financially impactful. So what is it about a divorce exactly that is so financially devastating?
Well, to start with, you're going from one household into two. And no matter how things turn out, you're not going to be able to divide up the pots and pans evenly. So somebody's going to have to set up a new household, and that's just huge if you have to go out and buy that stuff. Or if you're used to having two incomes to support a household, suddenly you have two different houses and there's two different electric bills and so on. It just it doesn't double everything, but it's a huge hit that you take.
It's sort of like going way back to when maybe you just got out of college and you have to refigure out what your finances are again.
Well, except that you likely have a whole lot more expenses. Now you might have a car loan, mortgage. You're in a different place than you were when you're footloose and fancy-free in your early 20s.
And that's without speaking of anything like lawyer fees that you might have to pay or anything else along those lines.
Right.
Okay, yeah. So that does paint a pretty dismal picture as far as getting yourself back on track financially.
Well, and I think, too, don't forget that sometimes there's debt involved. I mean, you talked about the car loan and the auto loan, but at the same time, there might be credit card debt and other types of debt that if you share that debt, that can be devastating, too.
Yeah, there's one point I want to make on that, Miranda, and thank you for reminding me if you don't remember anything else. But this, let's say you have a joint credit card, and you decide as part of your divorce settlement that, let's say, the husband is going to pay it, even though they both incurred the charges, or it was just whatever it was, you decide he's going to pay the joint credit card. It's in your settlement agreement, terrific. But then what happens is he doesn't pay it, right? Now it's a joint card, it's still hitting the wife's credit. So you would think you go to the credit card company and say, hey, credit card company, we had this agreement. He was going to pay the bill. He's not paying the bill. And it doesn't work that way because the bank says, well, I don't care about your settlement agreement. I wasn't a party to that. I'm a bank. You have a joint account, and that's all I care about. So it can be really devastating to find out that what you thought was an agreement, it's an agreement between you and the court, but not between you and the bank.
Is there something specific that the couple can do to make sure that debt is transferred to one person, that they're responsible for it, or is it just something that you kind of have to hope on your agreement to take care of?
Well, I think it would be best if you could try to settle it in advance. If you can balance transfer to individual accounts, just something to get it away from being a joint account. If you can take care of that before the divorce, that's probably the better way to go.
So, I mean, even with the best intentions, it might still be a great idea to, like you said, maybe use a balance transfer to an individual card to whomever might be responsible for the final debt.
Right. Or however you've agreed to split it. Yeah.
And I would imagine that even if the other person is paying it off, if they don't pay it off in full, maybe they're even just paying it off month to month, who knows, that still has some impact on the other person's credit going along that they might not want to have on there.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch your last question.
I'm just saying how if one person agrees to pay off the debt, they may not be paying it off in full. Maybe they're paying it month to month. But I would imagine that if both names are on that account, it's still affecting the other person's credit.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And particularly once they realize that there's all kinds of different expenses, once they're on their own, the credit card payments that they had anticipated making, they might find to be a whole lot more difficult.
It's a good thing to know about.
And I think too, another thing to consider about debt is if you're in a community property state. Sometimes even if your name isn't on the debt, it can still be your debt if you're in a community property state. And so that can be kind of a rude awakening. So when you wake up and realize that even though your name's not on the debt, you also have to help share it. It might be shared out during your settlement. So,
Right, good point.
Community property, good time.
So really,
Arizona, Washington,
Idaho. I think I don't remember how many there are. We'd have to double check. But yes, you need to check and see if you're in a community property state before you get too far into it.
California.
That's kind of the famous one, right? Because all the actors and such who have the $1 million estates have to basically give up half of that.
Yeah, they have to give up 6 of the 12 bathrooms.
It's a hard life. So before even the divorce papers are signed, what should a person do to prepare financially for a divorce? Is there anything they should already be starting to think about before that actually happens?
Yeah, I think you have to take a close look at what your life is going to be like down the road. Take an inventory of what your assets are going to be, or what you think they're going to be, what debts you're going to have, and you're going to need a new budget. Whether you had one before or not, you're going to have to figure out what your expenses are going to be, because whatever they were before, it's not what they're going to be going forward. You might be paying alimony, maintenance, or child support. You might be receiving that amount. It's definitely going to be a different picture afterwards. As you were saying when we started out, divorce is financially devastating, and it's pretty hard to imagine a situation where you're going to be better off. So, trying not to be
well, at least at first,
too
right?
deadly.
It's better later, right?
Right.
But at least
Not
at
necessarily.
first.
You won't be better off. Maybe you'll be better off emotionally and so on and so forth. But financially, you're going to take a hit some way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
And it'll get better later.
Yeah, we're supposed to be talking about recovery.
I hope here.
Painting the doom and gloom for you.
Right. We don't want to completely
But you should be
discourage
ready
people
for
who
that, I
are
guess.
generally
Yeah.
genuinely want to
it's
go
good
through
to think about, though. If you haven't gotten to that point yet where you are getting married, it's important to think about those things so you make sure you're thinking very carefully about the people that you're looking to spend your life with. Is this somebody that's going to be compatible with me? Are they financially savvy, or are they going out and spending all their money and racking up credit card bills? That might be a red flag before you want to get into a lifelong relationship with them. So in his book, Stop Acting Rich, Thomas J. Stanley surveyed 944 millionaires nationwide, and 91% of them were married to the same spouse for an average of 36 years. And of those, fully 2/3 had never been divorced. So he found that there's basically an inverse correlation between divorce and net worth. So as you were saying, you're probably not going to be in a better off situation if you do end up getting divorced. There is hope for recovering and recovering from that divorce, but it does have an adverse financial effect on you. So,
should a person do something like make sure that they have separate accounts before they're divorced, or make sure that their paycheck is going somewhere separately, or try to separate the finances out before the papers are signed?
Yeah, I think it makes sense. I mean, remember in all this, we're assuming that you're in agreement with your soon-to-be ex-spouse about how things are going to work, which very often, isn't the case. But if in the ideal world, yes, you'd have everything lined up. You'd have your separate accounts. You'd have your joint credit cards transferred to individual accounts. You'd have it all worked out who was getting the forks and knives. But that's in the ideal world, and we don't always live there.
Yeah, that's true, unfortunately. Along those same lines, if you're expecting it to be like very ugly, is it worth going that step of trying to hide money somewhere, or getting an investigator to try to track down money sources, or anything along those lines? I mean, maybe I'm just going off too much on things I see on TV, but my experience is limited in this.
Yeah, go ahead, hide it. What's the problem?
This does not constitute legal advice on the show.
Definitely not legal advice. Totally
Excellent disclaimer.
Don't hide it. Illegal.
Yeah, of course not. You don't want to be. You don't want to be doing that, and if you're on the other side of that, you don't want to be in a position where you have to hire an investigator to go and do forensic search on that kind of stuff. There's plenty of people out there that will do that. There's accountants and private investigators, people who specialize in that, and they cost money too, so you're paying them on top of a lawyer. You don't want to have to be in the position of having to get somebody to go ferret out where the assets are. But you might have to do that. Let's hope not. But yeah, hiding the assets, not good.
Okay. So don't start trying to think about that. Okay.
No. I was kidding. You have to get used to my sense of humor. I'm trying to lighten things up here.
But what I'm getting so far is that if you are going into a divorce, you really do need to take some time to think about where your finances are going to be and what your expenses are going to be and what your lifestyle is going to be and what it's going to cost, and then kind of go from there and figure out how you're going to move with that then.
Yeah, I think the hard part is, we're talking about this like it's all a rational process and that you're dealing with two rational people, and probably nothing could be further from the truth, because it's such an emotional upheaval, and you have two people who have decided for whatever reasons that they're going to go their separate ways. It's not a rational time. So as much as we would like to think that it is, and you can agree on everything, you can see how people get really entrenched in battles over stuff.
Now, I imagine, something like even buying a home becomes such an emotional experience that we lose track of the rational aspect of it, and then maybe we make a decision, we buy too much house, we do all sorts of different things. How does one person try to stay rational and try to keep their head about them during a divorce so that they're not maybe giving up something, overlooking something that they should be keeping track of?
Well, I think personal therapy could be a good thing. You don't want to use your lawyer as a therapist, number one, because you're paying them probably high rates per hour, and that's not their job. I think I read something recently where the lawyer said, he'll let them cry for one session, and then, that's it. Then he'll refer them out to a therapist, a counselor for personal issues. So that's something else to think about to help you deal things. It's kind of like you need a whole bunch of experts on your side. But experts, there's another expense you have to think about. You have a lawyer, maybe you have a counselor. If we're going into that situation we talked about before, a forensic accountant. You want good people on your team, but you don't want to decimate your finances by having to shell out for everything.
But having somebody maybe on your team, be it professional help or just like really solid friends and family that you could at least bounce ideas off and talk to, might be enough to at least help ground you a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. Sometimes you need somebody to just, smack you and say, forget about the pots and pans, just let go. Let go of something. It's better to just get through this than, because things become symbolic. It's not so much the pots and pans. It's, it's a control thing.
Right. It's the pots and pans that the two of you bought together on that third whatever in this state or whatever. And yeah, Oh,
Yeah, and he uses them more for his specialty cooking. You know, you can go on forever over who should have them, who's entitled to them. And at some point, you just got to let it go.
Yeah, in reading up for this show, I actually was reading a bit about how it is for a lot of people pretty important to seek out some professional help, especially for their finances, just because it is such an emotional time. They're under so much stress, and the stress of figuring out all those things on their own can be really tough, especially because you're going through almost like a mourning process. Maybe you're mourning the lost relationship, and you're having to deal with all that, and it can be hard to rationally think about all those facts and figures and numbers and so forth.
Yeah, that's right.
I would think, Peter, that's especially true in relationships where one person, be it husband or wife, did a lot of the financial decision-making or financial record-keeping. Obviously, in many cases, one person has sort of a dearth of skills in that field. So I would think yet another burden to sort of learn all that stuff, even if you have a good team, is probably a real uphill climb for some people.
Yeah, that's a great point, Kyle. If one person's been doing all the budgeting, all the bill paying, and then all of a sudden the other person's on their own and they just have never been doing that. They don't know about the investments. They don't know how much they should put into their 401k. They don't even know what the investments are. They're not used to paying the bills or having them deducted from their pay regularly. If you haven't been a part of that process, and which isn't the worst thing in the world, because couples sometimes delegate that to one or the other. One is better at doing the bill paying and the other one's better at the investment. So it's not like it's a bad thing that those chores were split, but if you suddenly have to do all of it on your own, it could be overwhelming.
And probably it's just a general good thing to maybe just, even if you have a great marriage, to just kind of stay on top of those things every once in a while and just get together and say, hey, what is happening here? Just in case something happens, how do I keep track of all this stuff? Just so that everybody's in on everything and they know how to do things if, God forbid, something happened.
All right. Whether it's divorce, death, doom and gloom.
Yeah, that's just
or anything
good financial planning. You got to prepare for the worst, no matter what it is. You don't see it coming, kind of thing.
So, once the divorce is final, what changes does a person need to take care of financially, legally, at that point?
There's a whole bunch of things. Some you probably wouldn't even think of. Someone, can't remember who it was, mentioned wills and trusts. I know when I decided to get divorced, the first thing I wanted to do, the first stop was to a divorce lawyer. The second stop was to the lawyer who had done my will, and I said, I think I want to change this, because if I get hit by a bus tomorrow, I really don't want him getting everything. So you have to make those changes. I mean, there's state laws that come into play with that, and federal laws over 401k. You can't exclude your spouse while you're still married without getting their consent. That's just on 401ks. So change, update wills and trusts where you can, beneficiaries where you can. So that's one set of things to deal with.
I think too, going back to your beneficiaries point, like if you've got a beneficiary for like a financial account or an insurance policy or something like that, if you change your will but you don't change your beneficiary, it's the beneficiary that gets it. So it doesn't matter what your will says if you haven't changed your life insurance, your retirement, your savings accounts, all of that stuff that has that sort of, like your health savings account or whatever, all of that stuff, it'll go to who you've named as your beneficiary no matter what it says in your will. So I think, going back to your point there, Valerie, it's very important to make sure that all of that stuff is taken care of.
And another good point, that it's important to know what all your financial accounts are and where they are and where they're going and who's on them in general. Because I guess for a lot of people, this might be the point where they are first digging up a lot of these things too and trying to track it down.
Right. You might have forgotten who you even named for some of these beneficiaries. I mean, if you have an IRA or life insurance, and then you've got your 401k, and then you have your will, you might have not even named the same people consistently. So it's a good time to review all of that.
Yeah, just a story to kind of drive that point home. I read a news story recently. I don't remember where it was, but it was about a lady who had been married for 2 or 3 years to one guy, and then he was just an awful person, and beat her and all this stuff, and they ended up getting a divorce. She never remembered about a certain life insurance policy that she had that had him as a beneficiary. She went on to be married for another 20, 25 years to another guy, and then she got cancer and ended up dying. But she had never changed the beneficiary on that life insurance policy. And this other guy ended up getting the money from that policy. So, it doesn't seem like it makes any sense, but you got to make sure that you go through and actually change those things.
Yeah. It's kind of a sobering thought. No, it's just one of the things. Like you don't think of these things. You don't go into a process like that, with the checklist necessarily, unless you go into it knowing that, okay, once this happens, I have to go in and change A, B, C, D, and E. And I imagine that gets even a little more complex if you have to change a name back, because now you have to go through all these different legal procedures to make sure maybe your license and your passport and so on and so forth, that everything still has you as whatever name you're going to go by, if that's what the road you're going down. So it's a lot of ducks to get in a row, as well as dealing with the emotional part and whatnot.
Well,
please, somebody go.
I was just gonna say, I think that's the hardest part. Like what we were saying before is you're in this emotional place that's very difficult, but you have to make these decisions, and so you have to make decisions, and it's hard to make the right decision when you're in this emotional place, and it's just this vicious cycle, I think, that people get caught in, which is why it's so difficult, and why, to a certain extent, having some sort of a checklist as I don't know, it sounds weird, but having some sort of a checklist, I think, might help, just if you can step back. I don't know.
One area I was going to say, and I didn't even really think this through until I read an article about it recently, which is taxes. Okay, going forward, how are you going to, if you're married on December 31, then you have to decide for that year, are you going to file married filing jointly or married filing separately? Okay, which you'll make based on any one of a number of things. It could cost you more one way or the other. Then the following year, you're going to be single or you're going to be head of household. Well, your taxes are going to change. And maybe if you move to another state, then it's going to change. So that's something you're going to have to take into account when you're doing your budget, is how your income taxes are going to change. Then there's other considerations like, okay, if you have a house, the two decide to sell the house, you have to think about the timing of it, because if you were married when you sell it, then you can get the benefit of the exclusion from capital gains. What is it? It's twice as much than if you sold it and you were single. I don't know, I'm probably getting too technical, but you have to think about the timing of things and how it's going to affect you tax-wise.
Yeah, and don't forget figuring out dependents and who gets to claim them.
Right. And also alimony is it is taxable. It's taxable income normally to the person who receives it. I mean, here you think you're getting alimony or child support, and could be a nasty surprise when you find out it's taxable. And for the person paying it, it's either, I don't know whether it's a deduction or it's a tax credit, but
it's a deduction, I believe.
It's a deduction, yeah.
I believe it's a deduction.
Is it for both of those?
We should fact check that, but I believe it's a deduction.
Yeah, I think so too.
Is it for both of those? I think the rules are different between alimony versus child support.
Yeah, they're different.
As far as whether they're deductible and taxable. But again, I think the point here is another expert that you might want to consult, maybe before and afterwards, is a good reputable CPA.
Yeah.
To find out, because I can imagine, who gets to claim this, who's going to claim that, how is doing this one thing going to affect things going forward. Because, you don't want that nasty surprise a year later depending on when your divorce is, and find out, you think everything is set up, and then bam, you hit with a giant tax bill. That can't be fun.
Right.
As you're starting to heal.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's a good point, that having an accountant on that team that we talked about before is another important player to have there.
Yeah, more people like maybe could give you a rational answer or an explanation of how things work. Because I can only imagine there's just so many different things that you wouldn't think about, and you're certainly not emotionally ready to even think about, but that need to be answered yesterday, basically. So, I mean, for people who are going through a divorce or have gone through it, what are their biggest financial hurdles at that point?
I think it's the getting used to having two households, one income. I mean, that's just a completely different place to be. If you had two people and two incomes, it's just going to be completely different when you only have one of those incomes. Two houses, that means somebody's got to get set up. Come back to the pots and pans. So I hate to keep making the same point, but you have to think practically that things just aren't going to, they're just not going to divide equally, no matter how hard you try. And it's tough. It's, no matter how amicable, no matter how, even if you have finances that are fairly evenly matched, it's just not going to be the same.
How are things like credit scores affected by divorce? I mean, we talked about how, like, if you still have a credit card in both of your names that's maybe being paid off, that could be a drag, perhaps, on your credit history and score. Are there any other aspects that would affect that you know of?
No, because credit score doesn't take into account your marital status, so it's really your credit history. Are you paying your bills on time? And if you start falling behind because you're living on less of an income, then definitely it's going to have an effect on your score. Even if you had a great credit record in the years leading up to it, if you start paying late, not paying at all, missing out, definitely it's going to have a bad effect.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So you just want to
say it's probably more just from the crazy amounts of debt that you can take on in order to get a divorce. I was looking it up today, and in my home state of Minnesota, the average cost for a divorce in Minnesota is between $15,000 and $20,000. I mean, that's the average, so it could be even more than that. So add that on top of various other costs. If you're going to have to buy a new house, or be renting, and you have court costs, you have refinancing costs. Just the costs just keep adding up and up and up. And yeah, where you could get into trouble with your credit score and stuff is just because you've got so many new debts that are piling up that you can't keep up with them, and that's where your score takes a hit.
All right. Well, evidently you did more research than I did today, Peter.
10 minutes before we came on the show.
That's why we love Peter. He's always got great research for us. On top of his game. With the divorce expense, I mean, I guess the lawyer and such, are there any other fees in there that drive up that cost? I mean, I guess the lawyer would probably be the biggest part of it, but are there any other expenses that are part of that a person wouldn't necessarily know of until they go into it?
I think talking about the lawyer fees, I heard a great expression about this. A friend of mine was going to go through a very big, ugly, expensive divorce, and her lawyer said to her, look, we can send your kids to college or we can send mine. Meaning you can spend tens of thousands of dollars fighting this and you won't have any money to send your kids to college, or you can spend tens of thousands of dollars and me, the lawyer, I'll be able to send my kids to college. So
I mean, do you always have a choice like that, though? I mean, if the other person has a high-power attorney, I mean, is there that feeling like I've got to match that with somebody who's also, from a fancy firm and such?
Well, it also depends, I think, on some of the lawyers. I mean, some of them kind of revel in that sort of shark attitude of, gotta go get them. But others are trying to find um, the approach that's not going to chew up a lot of their clients' money. So depending on what you want, do you want a shark in a suit? What is it, a gladiator? Is that what a gladiator in a suit? Or whether you better call Saul.
Hey, he does some pretty magic stuff. I mean, the show hasn't come out yet, but from what I've seen, it's pretty impressive. Is there anything that can be done to make divorce less expensive? I mean, like, let's say it's an amicable break. I mean, what can you do to reduce that cost? Is it worth, I've heard that there's forms you could get and just you both sign them and turn them in. Is that even a possibility or worthwhile? Or should you always go through the big legal procedure with lawyers?
I think you should, at the very, very least, have a consult with somebody, with a lawyer. I'm never one in favor of downloading stuff off the internet, like wills or anything, because there's no one size fits all for stuff. And I think you owe it to yourself to get an expert's view on things you might not even have thought of. I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to go through a bloody war over it, but get somebody who is knowledgeable and would be looking out for your best interests, and see where you go from there. If you can agree on, the more you can agree on things with your spouse, the less expensive, less gut wrenching it's going to be.
That's a good point. It's not the lawyers that are expensive; it's going to court that's expensive. So
yeah,
if you're both on the same page, then they're just doing up the paperwork kind of thing.
Right.
For somebody out there that's maybe hurting financially, maybe they haven't been in the workforce, maybe after the whole divorce is done, there's still not a lot of money coming in. Are there any services out there that would help a person out? Is there any place a person can go to say, hey, you know what, I need some financial advice. I need somebody that can help me get back on track here and kind of get my head around all of this?
Excuse me. Yeah, I guess I've been talking about couples where there's two incomes, and I've been totally ignoring the fact that maybe one person didn't have income. I mean, that's tough. It's just like somebody losing their job and being unemployed. Where do you start? I guess you start with, what skills do you have? What could you develop? Can you afford to get some kind of training? I don't know, but fortunately I'm employed. I don't know where you go to get that kind of advice. I'm sure it's out there.
So it's worth looking out there for, if you think that you're buried in it and you can't get your head around it, there might be some services out there that could help you. So it's worth at least looking into.
Oh, definitely. I just don't know what they are.
Well,
okay.
Anybody else?
Well, I was going to say, you should always start with community resources.
Yeah.
There are always community resources. If you go to like a local women's shelter, or if you go to a local employment office like Workforce Services, that's run by almost every state has a Workforce Services office in most major towns. So you can go to the Workforce Services office, see what's there, get counseling, ask your lawyer what sort of resources are available. But there are, and if you're religious, go to your congregation, ask for resources there. There are always community resources available if you ask around. And it's hard, I know, to like sit back and say, oh, I need to ask for help. But when you're in this situation, you really do need to ask for help.
So you should have asked Miranda that question.
I throw the questions out there in general.
Our church has a thing called Divorce Care Ministries too, and basically they help out people who are going through a tough divorce or whatever. So they have a couple of guys that are financial guys that'll help people to start with a budget and get their financial ducks in a row, and then they have psychologists and other counselors or therapists that will donate time to help these people through the tough time and stuff like that. So, like Miranda was saying, I think your community resources, your church or whatever, are good places to look to.
And I always, like I said, I always like to start with the local women's shelter. There are usually lots of good resources you can find if you can go to the local women's shelter. Even if you're not in a position where you've had abuse or you have that issue, just going to the local women's shelter usually provides some sort of resources where you can get started. And then, like I said, also workforce services when you go to your state workforce services or workforce department.
And to be fair, it also may be a situation where it's the guy who maybe is without the income and maybe is getting his feet back on track. So, take those same routes, but maybe not the women's services place. But
to workforce services.
Yeah.
There's
still support out there.
Stay-at-home dads like Glenn, right?
That's right.
Hey, let's knock on wood, everything's good here, right?
Wow.
So are there any other like financial surprises that pop up in a divorce that a person might not expect or be aware of? I guess we talked about taxes and maybe making sure your beneficiaries are all set up. But is there anything else out there that, if you didn't know, if you've never been through the process, you wouldn't even have known it until it happened?
I'm thinking it has nothing to do with financial, but I'm thinking you have to divide up the friends, and that's something that's very hard. Completely not financially related, but there's going to be, you can't share all of them. I mean, people are sort of naturally going to fall on one side or the other.
So I mean, there definitely is a big emotional impact, even if you're somehow amicable or whatever. There's a lot going into it when you're going through a divorce.
Yeah.
So, excuse me, before maybe even a divorce is on the table, is there anything that a person could do to protect themselves financially?
Well, the question comes up a lot about having a prenup, and there's really a couple of very different views on that. Some people say it's smart business planning. You really should do that. You're going to save yourself a heck of a lot of time, trouble, and expense if you have a prenup. Then there's the other school of thought which says if you have that going in, then there's some part of you thinking this isn't going to work out. I might get divorced. Then what are you doing getting married in the first place?
It's like having insurance on it almost.
Yeah.
For the person that's coming in with the bigger estate.
Right. So there's two schools of thought on that one. But it also depends on where you are in your financial life. If you're two kids just starting out, you don't have anything, it's a whole different picture from it's a second marriage and one person has considerable assets and there's kids involved and everything. So something to think about. And also postnuptial agreements. If you've been married a while and then there's some kind of significant change. Maybe you each had children by a prior marriage and now you have a child in your new marriage, or somebody, their financial position changes significantly, then you might have a postnuptial agreement. So again, smart business move or predicting doom down the road.
Who wants to have that conversation?
Yeah. Well, I've said that it's not so much whether you have a prenup or not. It's the discussion that you have about it. Because if one person says, well, if you trusted me, you wouldn't need one, and the other one says, well, if you trusted me, then you wouldn't worry about signing one. So it's more about that, how you handle that conversation than what eventually comes out in the paper. More lawyer paper.
And not necessarily that's something that you need, but it probably doesn't hurt to have more financial discussions in general.
Right.
For any marriage or couple that are getting together. It's probably something that doesn't happen enough.
See, the lawyers are making out on each end of this, on the front, on the back end. I can see why they make so much money.
Well, I think too, protecting yourself before divorce. I think part of it too is kind of building up some of your own assets as well. I mean, I know we like to say, oh, we got to have a joint account. My husband and I have a big pot sort of arrangement with our finances, but We each also have our own credit cards. Instead of joint credit cards, we have our own credit cards, and we each have our own retirement account. I have a retirement account. He has a retirement account. Obviously, he's my beneficiary and I'm his. I mean, that's how it works. But I think having your own assets or your own credit as well to draw on helps too before you are in this situation, so that you're not completely starting all over on your own. So you have kind of your own foundation.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Now, Valerie, you had mentioned kids just a moment ago. Are there any special financial concerns or situations that arise because of children? I mean, obviously you have a whole child support aspect of it, but is there anything else that might need to be a consideration for somebody down the line or as it's happening?
Oh, sure. That's a whole other ball of wax. The arrangements of where the kids are going to live and stay and be shuttled back and forth, and who's buying lunch for them and dinner and paying for school expenses. And that's a whole other discussion in and of itself. So far, we've been only talking pretty much about a couple, husband, wife. Bring the kids into it. It's a whole other scene.
So not only do you have to consider maybe your own budget, but like a whole lifestyle of somebody else's budget that is going to grow as they grow.
Right.
As they get older, they're going to have different budget considerations that you have to take into effect in your agreement with the person you're divorcing.
Are they going to go to college? Who's going to pay for that? Who's going to save for that?
And like you said, I mean, I guess if one person gets it for this amount of time, how does that travel pay out? How does, like, every little cost that's going to come across with the child is now the question arises is who's going to pay what on it?
All right.
Whew. So here's another question. I mean, before you even do it, how do you know if divorce is even the right road to go down? I mean, obviously we have been talking about how cost prohibitive it is. What should a person do before they get to that point to see if that's even where they should be?
Well, I think I guess the standard answer would be maybe try couples counseling, see if you can find some way through it. I mean, nobody wants to get divorced. It's not anything anybody wants to go through. Every couple, every situation is going to be different. And I think you have to give it some time. You can't just sort of decide after one big fight, that's it, I'm cutting loose. So I think getting an outside perspective is pretty key for starters.
And with talking about how expensive it is, should a person let those expenses keep them from a divorce? Like, I mean, let's say you're with somebody and you know what, it really isn't working. For whatever reason, it could be something that you're just not getting along, or it could be something that's even worse. It's violence, it's abusive, whatever. Should you let those expenses be something that prevents you?
Well, of course, the easy answer is to say, no, of course you shouldn't. You should go out and do what's right. But it's just not always that simple. I knew of a couple where they literally couldn't afford to have one of them move out. They couldn't maintain two separate residences, particularly since they had kids. And they had to stay living together in the same house. I think one of them went and lived in the basement or whatever. That's not a real happy place to be, but that's where they felt they were forced to be, is until the point where they got to some other situation where they could afford it. They were forced to stay in that house.
Yeah, I guess.
And I think in some states as well, as far as the filing fees to get divorced and the paperwork, you have to pay the filing fees. There's a lot of times income-based help for people, so you can get, a lot of states won't make you pay the fees. So it's something to look into if you truly do have a financial need.
And it does seem like in general you have to take your state and where you live into effect as far as every aspect of it, and find out what needs to be done. And I guess that's where a good lawyer and advice comes into play. So we've certainly discussed a lot about divorce, and for sure it's something that's, it's going to be expensive and it can be financially devastating. But there is a light at the end of the tunnel, isn't there, Valerie?
Yeah, there certainly is. You'll get to a place someday where you're in charge of your finances. You don't have to have somebody else make decisions for you. You can buy the car that you want or not buy a car. You could live where you want. Things aren't necessarily going to be easy, but you're going to be the decision maker. I think that can be very freeing for people, that you don't have to compromise maybe with somebody who wasn't so good at compromising.
So thank you, Valerie, for joining us today and talking about this definitely sobering subject. And I think it's important for everybody to think about, especially if it's something that you're even considering, and knowing what you're going to get into. For those out there who may want to learn a little bit more about you, where can they find you and you and your work?
Okay, well, my website is valerierind.com. My last name is R-I-N-D, like watermelon. And so is everything else. Facebook is Valerie Rind. Twitter is @ValerieRind. Google plus Valerie Rind.
Consistency, very good.
Right. Spell it right once and you've got it. And I recently published a book, as you mentioned at the start, Glenn. It's called Gold Diggers and Deadbeat Dads. And it's all true stories of what happens when you mix your friends and your family and your finances. And it's based on my own true story and true stories of a couple of dozen people that I interviewed. So, for example, situations where you loaned your nephew money and he didn't pay you back. And there was a situation, I think, Peter, you were describing it, where somebody didn't update a will. And actually, there were two stories of that. And people who really weren't supposed to get the money got the money because somebody didn't update wills and IRA beneficiaries. So it's all these gruesome stories, but it also has tips for prevention of these kind of financial problems and what to do if this sort of thing has happened to you. And it's interspersed with what I've been told are touches of humor. To keep it from being a total downer. So you can get that on Amazon in paperback and ebook, and also Barnes & Noble, Prenup, and the iBook store. I don't know if you can see it. Can you see the cover?
Yes. Hold on a second.
Hold up.
We're all talking, so the screens jump around, but there we go. There's Valerie's book. So give it a look. And I think what you have there is a great example of the fact that, if you're going through some financial situation like a divorce, you're not the only person that's ever done it. People have gone through this also. So just knowing other people's stories and that other people have gone through it before you can take a lot of weight off of you. There's not necessarily something wrong with you. It's just the situation that's happening.
Yeah, that's exactly why I wrote it, was to show people that they weren't the only ones that these kinds of things happen to. That the details of the stories might be different, but the themes are very common.
Thank you again. Thank you again, Valerie, for joining us and helping our listeners out with this emotional subject of divorce. Everyone out there, thank you for listening and watching us. And until next week, be good with your money.
Thanks for joining us on the Money Mastermind Show. Get more information at moneymastermindshow.com. Don't forget to subscribe to the show on iTunes and YouTube and follow us on Google+.